One of the questions that I asked over and over again to try and discern is what makes a Christian community unique? There are a whole host of communities that you can be a part of. A country club, a running club, a reading club, or your PTA or whatever the case may be, right? There are a number of human organizations that are out there, but what makes a Christian community that is the church unique? Now let me explain it this way. Every community has a standard of acceptance, right? So if you're a university, you need to have a certain GPA, or you need to have a certain certain number of volunteer hours or extracurriculars, right? That's what gets you in. And that standard of quality is what binds that particular community together. How about a certain workplace? You need to have the right kind of resume, a work experience, or how you do in the interview, or who you know in the company, right? That's what gets you in the door at a particular workplace. And that standard of quality is what binds the community together. So what is that for a Christian community? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his kind of seminal work, many would consider, on Christian community called Life Together, puts it this way. He says, the community of the Spirit, that is the church, the community of the Spirit is the fellowship of those who are called by Christ. And in contrast to that, he says, human community of spirit is the fellowship of devout souls. Now, if you're like me, you're doing a double take on that quote. It's like, what does that mean? And I had to do that as well. Here's what he's saying. A mere human community is one in which people who are serious about their religion are gravitated towards one another. And that kind of community is held together by their common devotion about how serious we are about the matters of religion. In contrast to that, Bonhoeffer says, a church is a community in which people are drawn to Jesus. And that community is held together by the belief that Jesus is the one who is devoted to them. Do you see the difference there? One community is all about human devotion, how good we are, how serious we are about religion. The other is utterly serious about Jesus, and it's held together not by some quality that mere human beings exhibit, but it's held together by the common belief that Jesus is the one that is devoted to them. One is based on how good you are. The other is based on how good Jesus is. Now, up until this point, we've been going through a sermon series on the book of James, and the book of James is a letter that was written by James, who was a brother of Jesus. And up until this point, James has been making a point time and time again that it is not enough for you to know the truths of Christianity, but that you need to live it out. It's not enough for you to just know it in your head. You need to know it in your heart and with your hands. And your Christianity, your faith, is exhibited in your lifestyle. He's been saying that all up until this point. But even as James is writing this letter, he is well aware that in any given Christian community, there are some who are going to listen to that and say, yes and amen, I'm doing all of those things. But there are still others who are going to hear that and say, that is not what I'm doing at all. I am not living out the thing that I say I believe in. And so what are we to make of this composition? James has been bringing challenges and exhortations over and over again all throughout the letter. But here, in these last couple of verses, as he closes out the letter, he brings all of these challenges and exhortations down to the level of the messiness of human community, that is the church. And he's saying, in light of that reality, what are you supposed to look like as a community? And in what ways are you going to display the uniqueness that is the Christian church? In some ways, as we close out the sermon series on the letter of James and the book of James, it is appropriate that we are beginning the season of Advent, because Advent is a time in which we look forward to Christmas. when the Savior and King would come and give us a vision for the world that could be. But it is a time in which we learn to wait. Learn to wait in the in-between, in which we, living in the messiness of what is, look ahead to what could be. And this is what James teaches us today. He gives us a portrait of a church. What kind of place should a church should be? And we learn three things. One, it tells us that church is a place where wanderers are welcome. Secondly, we learn that a church is a place where wanderers are brought in. And lastly, he teaches us how wanderers are brought close. Church is a place where wanderers are welcome, where they're brought in. And lastly, he teaches us how wanderers are brought close. So first, a church is a place where wanderers are welcome. Now, the closing verses begin with James saying, "My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth." I'll tell you, as a preacher, I love preaching short passages because we can do a deep dive into each word. And so he begins by saying, if anyone among you wanders from the truth. Here's a scenario that James is playing out. There's somebody within the community of the church who moves away from God. He says, he talks about it in terms of wandering, which is aimlessly moving away from a given path. And we'll talk about more of that in a moment. But notice, James doesn't say, if anyone among you wanders away from the church. The assumption that James has from the beginning of the passage is this: there are going to be those in the church that are strong and have it all together, but there are also going to be those who are wandering away from God. And this is the assumption of the Bible from start to finish in the way it thinks about the community of God that is the church. The church is always going to be filled with those who are, yes, close to God, but also, and vitally so, those who are far from Him. And that is okay. And we have examples all throughout Scripture, but let me just give you one. The book of 1 Corinthians is a letter that was written by Paul to the church that is in a city called Corinth. Now, Corinth at the time was known for its debauchery and materialism, hedonistic lifestyle. And Paul addresses the church in Corinth and calls the church out and many of its members for the ways in which they caved to the kind of cultural moment of the time, and calling out some of the evil and wicked ways that the church members were behaving. Okay? And some of them are really kind of heinous deeds. And Paul, all throughout the letter, calls out all kinds of evil behavior that he's finding in the church. And yet, at the same time, what's striking about this letter is Paul is also desperate in his call to keep that church together. Paul doesn't say, you guys messed up. All of you holy ones that have your life together, that are moral and religious enough and serious about your faith enough, you need to leave and go be another church, a pure church. Paul doesn't say that. He is desperate in trying to keep the church messiness of it all together. So much so that if you look at 1 Corinthians 12, here's what he says. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. He doesn't say just the devout ones, just the ones that have perfect marriages and are doing well in their career and are morally upright. He says all suffer together and all rejoice together. Now, you may be looking at that and saying, wait, aren't there instances in which, folks exhibit behavior that is so destructive for them and other people that, they need to be excommunicated? I would say yes. And actually, if you look at earlier on in the letter in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul cites such a case. But be that as it may, the default posture that Paul and the rest of the Bible calls for towards all members of its community is that of commitment. James, again, up to this point, has been stressing the commitment to right living. But as he closes out the letter, he emphasizes just as much the need for a commitment to those who don't. And the church, if it's going to be a unique Christian community, needs to keep both those commitments. Commitment to live out the thing that we say we profess and believe in, and our commitment and love to those who don't. Let me tell you, over history, if you look at kind of church history, there have been numerous attempts for folks to not want to do this. There have been folks that tried to put communities together that tried to keep the church pure from wanderers. Okay. So these were communities that had an absurdly high kind of standard for admission into their midst, and very quickly excommunicated you if you did not measure up in terms of moral uprightness and religious commitment. And I will tell you, by and large, here's what happens to most of them. These communities almost always turn into cult-like religious communes. And here's the reason why. In their efforts to keep their community pure from the people that don't deserve to be there in their minds, they've become just like every other human organization. It's become all about them. And in so doing, they've become tiny little religious enclaves, religious bubbles that lack, hear me when I say this, because they've become just another human organization, they've lost their supernatural power to be effective in bringing anything good outside of its four walls, and is largely irrelevant to the rest of the world around them. Nor is there any meaningful transformation happening within, and usually ends with bickering and fights and judgment. See, if a church is to be a Christian church, it needs to be a place in which wanderers are welcomed in. Now, let me just say, if you're sitting here, and I don't know where all of you are in terms of your relationship with Christianity, let me just say, if you are doubting, if you have questions, if you have kind of moral issues that you're dealing with, and if you feel like you don't have it all together, let me tell you, you've come to the right place. You are welcome here, even if that hasn't been your experience in other places. I can tell you, at least as a leader of this church, this is where you need to be. Because we are passionate about right living, but we are just as passionate about loving on those and welcoming those who don't live as they should, who don't fit in, who are wandering. But another thing that I need to tell you as we get into the second point here is that we are going to be passionate about bringing you back. You should know that up front. So that's the second point. Church is also a place where wanderers are brought in. Now that's the second half of verse 19. Let me just read verse 19 over again for you. It says, "My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth," and then the second half it says, "and someone brings him back." Now the first thing that I want you to notice here is that James isn't assigning roles. There aren't kind of special roles in the church that are the bringer-backers. Bring those who bring back. What's interesting is, because last week we were taught from Pastor John the passage that came prior to that there are certain ways in which we respond to life circumstances that require certain officers or leaders in the church. So one example that was given from the last passage was that if you are sick, what do? The pastor tells us, bring the elders to pray for you. right? There are certain times when that kind of an approach is appropriate, but here, I love James's choice of words. He says someone, anyone in the church. He is giving a clarion call to each member of the church to be on the lookout for one another, for those who are wandering, and it is your responsibility to bring them back. Not complain about them to the leaders, not gossip about them behind their backs, disguised as asking for prayer request. I know every one of you know what I'm talking about. Not secretly grumble about them and avoid them at all costs. James is saying each member of the church has been given a call to look out for one another, to draw them back to the truth and love. And that is the call that James is giving. Now, there are three things that this requires, okay, in order for you to be able to do this. Three things. First, you need the truth. Bringing somebody back implies there is something or some place to bring them back to. I mean, this is kind of the entire point of the book of James. There's a standard of behavior that is laid out by the truth of the gospel and the scriptures that will lead to your flourishing and flourishing to those around you. And that is God's command for all of life. And all of your life needs to be in accordance with that. Without this commitment to truth, there is nothing to bring these folks back to, right? You need truth. But secondly, it also requires love. If someone brings him back, the assumption there is that the person that is wandering, that James is giving a call for someone to bring back, is worth the effort. He's saying you need to change the way you look at folks that you think don't measure up to the standards of what Christian life ought to be. They're not some kind of useless growth that needs to be removed from the body for its health. No, they're a vital part of the body that needs to be nourished and restored back to health. Saying you need to change the way you look at these folks. And by the way, when you approach this person with love, and even if you were to have to confront them, then it will not be with judgment, but rather with compassion, empathy. But let me give you the last thing that you need. And it's the thing that you need for the first two to be able to happen, and the last thing is proximity. See, the church needs to consist of relationships that are intimate enough so that you recognize wandering, and even if you are to have to confront, have the buildup of trust for the other party to know that you are for them and not against them, and for you to have any chance of being heard. See, James uses the word wander here, and it's an image that is invoked of one who is walking down a road and slowly starts drifting away from the path that they're supposed to go. Now, if you were to take that into consideration, we're not talking about somebody who has, in a heat of the moment, committed some grievous sin, though that certainly might be the case and could lead to wandering. It's not even talking about somebody who says something crazy during Bible study that is heretical and not in accordance with biblical truth at all. That's not what James has in mind. It's talking about somebody who, over a long period of time, exhibits a pattern of constantly moving away from God. And that moving away is hard to discern from a distance. No, you need to draw near to be able to see these patterns, where you see a pattern of coldness towards God. You see a pattern of indifference towards others in the community. You see a pattern in which they continue to exhibit signs of skepticism and cynicism towards the things of God. How can you spot it? How can you see a pattern developing? Only if you are close enough to be able to see what is happening. Now, James here knows nothing of the kind of person that stands off at a distance and points fingers at everybody else, scolding them and complaining about them, hoping they would change. Let me tell you, you need all three. Let me tell you, if you have truth but no love, I'm sorry to break it to you like this, you're just going to be annoying. You're the kind of person that's going to be complaining all the time, but like nobody listens to you. They're just going to ignore you. You've become a nuisance because there's no love there. They know that you don't care anything about them. They just care about their principles. If you have love but not truth, you're going to be well liked. Everybody's going to be cordial with you. They're going to think you're pleasant, but you're not going to make any difference in anybody's life because you have no conviction. And the thing that binds everything together, I think, is the hardest thing for us, and that is proximity. And this requires having a community that is close enough. I'm not saying this entire church needs to be close, but you need to be a part of there, and there need to be pockets of community that are close enough and cares about one another to be able to speak the truth in love, to move near to them and not yell at them from a distance. Now, I want you to see how important this is. Okay, and let me put it to you this way: the Bible tells us that Christian salvation, because it is unearned. Okay, you can't earn Christian salvation, and because that is the case, the Bible tells us that you can't do anything to unearn your salvation. In other words, if you have Christian salvation, there is nothing that you can do to lose it, and therefore, if you are a Christian, you can know for certain that someday, somehow, God is going to bring that person back. And that is one of the promises that we hold on to when we baptize our infants. When we baptize our infants, we are saying that God's promise is sealed onto them, and God will make good on His promises and one day bringing them back. And so if your child has been baptized as an infant, you don't pray for your child as if they're an unbeliever outside the walls of the church, hoping for a supernatural miracle one day that they come to saving faith. No, you pray for your child as a parent claims the promises of God that are already sealed onto them, because they already belong in the household. Now, be that as it may, that's a bit of a side point there. But if you are a Christian, you cannot lose your salvation. But here is the danger. There are people that have been active members of churches their entire lives, but who actually never put their faith in Jesus Christ, who's never actually had a saving encounter with them. And there are so many people in the churches that I've had the privilege of ministering to over the years that would say things like that, like, I've been in church all my life and I never really understood the gospel. And for those folks who grew up perhaps in a Christian culture with enough church around them for these biblical teachings to bleed out their ears, if they were to wander away and say, you know what, I tried the Christianity thing, never really worked for me. And if they wander away, let me tell you, it is nearly impossible for them to be brought back. And that is what is at stake here. Friends, if you've been in the church for a number of years, you know people that are like this. Is your heart breaking for them the way God's does? Or this whole time were you so hell-bent on protecting the moral and religious purity of the church that you never paid them no mind? That is a challenge that James is putting before us today. Wanderers need to be brought back into the church. And that is God's heart, as His heart is for the one lost sheep over the 99. Are we the kind of church that is content being the 99, congratulating one another and being cordial with others and paying no mind to the one sheep that is lost? those in the margins, those who are the black sheep, if you will, those who are wandering. I lay this as a challenge for us not to scold you, or maybe I am, but only because I'm scolding myself. There are ways in which I looked at ministry that I really that needed reformation, if you will, from this text. And I think it should serve as a sobering wake-up call for the church. Now, as I'm saying these things, if you're listening, it might conjure up kind of feelings of insecurity and discomfort, as it has for me. I think about all these people that I just kind of never paid them any mind as they're wandering away and that kind of a thing. And to be honest, more than that, it conjures up feelings of discomfort. Because I look at truth, love, and I'm like, I think I could do it. But proximity, isn't that the hardest thing for us? To give ourselves and be involved in a community that is close enough? I'm busy. I got kids and I got responsibilities, and it's hard. How can we do this? And that's the last point. How are wanderers brought close? What's it going to take, right? What's it going to take for there to be a renewal in the life of the church? That there's hearts that are reawakened to be aligned once again with the priorities of God, who is a good shepherd that is going to go out and claim the lost sheep. As I thought about this, I thought of these verses that come from Hebrews chapter 3. It's in verses 12 to 13. And it hit me in ways that I didn't expect it to hit. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It says, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness." Now, as I look at this passage, here's one thing that stands out. These verses are warning us against the deceitfulness of sin. Right? That means it's almost giving like an active agency to sin in deceiving us from knowing and experiencing and living out of what is true. And it's a condition where you don't even know you've been hardened in your heart and turning away from God. What is the remedy to that? Hebrews 3 says. It says, encourage one another daily. Now let me tell you, I don't know about you, I don't do that. I don't encourage one another. I don't encourage others daily. I don't receive that kind of encouragement daily enough to be able to fight against the hardening of my heart, against the deceitfulness of sin. And I'm willing to bet the majority of us in this room are not engaged in a community that looks like this, one where there's regular, habitual encouragement of one another. Maybe it happens once every 2 weeks. Sometimes we skip it maybe once a month. Does it happen regularly like this? And here's a sobering conclusion that I've come to. Then it could be possible that myself, and for most of us in this room, have had our hearts hardened by the deceitfulness of sin, and we don't even know it. How do you grow to care enough about those in your community to draw near in proximity to them and to speak truth and love to them? I think this is the first step. You and I, we need to admit and say to ourselves, maybe I am the one who is wandering. Let me tell you, I became a Christian sometime between, I want to say sophomore, junior in college. And soon after that, I became the leader of our college ministry. And during that time, I had a friend who was a couple years behind me. And her, myself, and another friend of mine, we were really, really good friends. And that person is not Helen, my wife, somebody else. But we were really, really good friends. And she had absolutely no religious background, but she was interested in Christianity. So she began to kind of dip her toes, right, into kind of Christian community and that kind of a thing. She had an amazing voice. And so she even sang at one of her kind of like fundraiser for mission trips and that kind of a thing. And she was starting to get more involved. And I remember having great hope for her. She had struggled with depression for a very, very long time and bouts of really extreme loneliness. And I prayed and I prayed and I prayed that through our kind of involvement in our Christian community that she would find Jesus. Here's the problem. The problem was that certain aspects of her lifestyle, while it would have been completely normal for other college students, but for those in the Christian community that I was involved in college, was an absolute no-go. It was taboo. And I remember watching with great anger and dismay as words and gossip about her spread throughout the community. And over time, what happened to her wasn't exactly shunning. I think Christians or religious people are much too cordial and polite for that to happen. But over time, there was a gradual detachment from her. We were just hanging out. We just forgot to call her. And over time, there was this gradual detachment. And you know what? Like, when I talked to her about it, the most heartbreaking part was she didn't even make much of it. She was like, yeah, they're religious people, and so, they might be against me doing this or that. So it's, it's okay. It's normal. That's what religious people do. And so she slowly drifted away. And I remember, I think it was about, I want to say year and a half from this season, she tragically passed away when her depression got the best of her. And I remember grieving in the hospital where she passed. And I remember I was filled with wrath and sadness and grief all mingled into this ugly mess. But in the years since, as I reflected back on this incident, I have to say that was probably, that moment right there sitting in that hospital room was probably one of the most formative moments in my life in ministry in terms of what I prioritize. But because of this one realization, the realization was this. Up until this time, I saw her as the wanderer, the black sheep, the lost one. I think the painful realization that I come to was realizing that myself and those who were most embedded into Christian community, we were probably the ones that were the most lost. We were the ones who were wandering. I went from, how dare they judge her and treat her like this, to, man, we are so hopelessly lost. At least she knew it. We have no idea. And friends, if you are at that place, if there's something stirring in your heart as you're hearing this, and you're wondering, maybe I'm the one who is wandering, here is your only hope. Here is my only hope. Is to hear the call of Jesus Christ beckoning you in. Because at Christmas, God took on flesh to be born, to live the life that you and I should have lived. He drew near to you in proximity. And on the cross, he thunders a word of truth and saying, you are so lost in your sin that it's going to take nothing less than the death of God to redeem you. And yet at the same time, he shines on you with his love and he says, I would rather on my flesh take on the penalty for sin that you deserve. And I will die with your sin to bring you in. That is God and Jesus Christ drawing you near. Let me just close with this story. Jesus Christ in the book of Luke tells a story of this prodigal son. It's about a young man, who is sick and tired of living under the care of his father. And so he asks his father for his share of inheritance that was due to him upon his death, and he takes all of this wealth and runs away to a faraway land. And there he lives a life of pleasure and hedonism. And, soon after he finds that he's blown all of this inheritance away, and he's living in poverty. And he one day finds himself eating out of a pigsty, and he says, "This is really terrible way to live." And so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get up and I'm going to go back to my father's house, and I'm going to beg and see if I can be one of my father's servants, because surely life as a servant of my father is much better than my life now. So he goes back, and it's a beautiful and moving story in which his father, seeing him walking towards him from a distance, runs up, girds up his loins, if you will, and runs towards him and embraces him. But here's one character in that story that is off to the side, and it's the older brother of this prodigal son. As all of this is unfolding, we see the elder brother folding his arms, refusing to celebrate. He does not deserve to be here. And the father has to plead with the elder brother to come in. Friends, what if the older brother had gone out searching for his younger brother? The passage here tells us, whoever brings back a sinner from wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. Here's what it's saying. God is saying, I want to use my people, the church, to be my instruments of salvation. I want to use my church to gather up all those who are lost, all those who are wandering, all those who need to hear this message of grace and mercy and love. He's saying, I want the church to be the elder brother that goes out, not crossing their arms, trying to purify a church as if that's possible. Jesus is looking to the church, and he's saying, I want elder brothers going out after the lost ones. Will you respond to this call, church? And let me just say a word to those of you that you know you're wandering right now. Man, you're saying, I'm not the kind of person that I need to be. I'm struggling with this or that. Let me tell you, if you're wondering right now, let me tell you, if you haven't experienced this with the church, as one of the mere humble servants of the church, let me just say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for being a terrible witness to the truth of the gospel. And let me dare welcome you in now. But let me also tell you that if you haven't experienced this with the church, you can experience this from God himself now. There's no wandering that is out of reach for the love of this God. A.W. Tozer puts it this way. He says, we need never shout across the spaces to an absent God. He is nearer than our own soul, closer than our most secret thoughts. You're coming into a presence of God who has given everything for you to draw near. He is not turned off by your wandering, your doubting, your questioning. He says, just come. Be in my presence. Friends, let us become that kind of church for all of our neighbors around us. Let's have our hearts realigned with the priorities of God himself. Let's pray.